I followed my husband's car for 2 years before I understood what silence was protecting. I want you to sit with that sentence for a moment, because it isn't the kind of thing a woman admits easily, even to herself. 2 years is a long time to doubt someone quietly. It is long enough to memorize the sound of his engine turning over in the driveway before you've even opened your eyes. It is long enough to learn which streetlights flicker on his usual route, which gas station he prefers, which hour of the evening his shoulders start to carry a weight I couldn't name. 2 years is long enough to become an expert in a man's habits while still being a stranger to his heart. Hello, my name is Diane, and this is the story of how I spent 2 years chasing a shadow I thought was a betrayal, only to discover, at the very end of that long, careful pursuit, that I had been following the outline of my husband's deepest grief the entire time. This isn't a story about another woman, though for 2 years I would have sworn to you on anything sacred that it was. This is a story about a phone call on a Thursday evening that changed the shape of his face forever, about a young woman with his exact eyes standing on our porch in the rain, and about the particular kind of love that hides itself not out of guilt, but out of fear of losing something twice. I want you to keep that image close as you listen, because everything that follows will test it, and I promise you, the ending will give it back to you, changed but not broken. I think, before I tell you how the following began, you should understand what kind of marriage we had before any of this. My husband and I had been married for 22 years by the time this story starts. We met in our late 20s, both of us a little bruised by our 20s in the ordinary ways people are bruised by their 20s, and we built something steady together, something I never once doubted, not for the first 2 decades of our marriage. He was not a demonstrative man, not the type to fill a room with declarations, but he was consistent in the way that matters more than most people realize until they're older. He remembered my coffee order without being told. He never went to bed angry, even when we'd fought hard enough that either of us would have been forgiven for it. I want you to hold on to that image of him, because I need you to understand that the man I began secretly following was the same, steady, gentle man I had trusted without question for 20 years, and that the unraveling of my trust had nothing to do with any change in his character. It had to do with a phone call. We had raised 2 children together by then, both nearly grown, and I remember thinking, in the ordinary complacency of a long marriage, that we had already survived the hardest chapters life could offer us. We had weathered a job loss, a difficult year with his own aging mother, a scare with my health in my 40s that turned out, thankfully, to be nothing at all. I believed, the way you believe the sun will rise, that whatever else life had waiting for us, we would face it the way we had faced everything else, side by side, with nothing of real weight left unspoken between us. I did not yet know that a single ringing phone could reveal how much I still didn't know about the man I had shared a bed with for 2 decades. It was a Thursday evening in April, 2 years ago now, and I remember the specific quality of the light because I have gone back to that memory so many times since, turning it over like a stone in my pocket. We were finishing dinner. His phone rang, an unfamiliar number, and he glanced at the screen, and something happened to his face that I had never once seen in 20 years of marriage. It wasn't fear exactly. It was closer to the look a man gets when a door he thought had been sealed shut for good suddenly creaks open again. He didn't answer it at the table. He excused himself, phone in hand, and walked out to the backyard, and through the window over the sink I watched him pace the length of our small garden for nearly 40 minutes, one hand pressed to his forehead, his voice too low for me to make out even a single word. When he came back inside, his eyes were red, though he tried to hide it by busying himself at the sink, rinsing dishes that were already clean. I asked him, gently, "Who was that?" He said, "Just an old work matter, nothing important." And his voice had a flatness to it I had never heard from him before, a flatness I would come to recognize, over the following 2 years, as the particular sound of a man lying to protect something he loved more than his own comfort. I want to be honest about what happened in me that night, because I think it's important for anyone listening who has ever felt the ground shift beneath a marriage they believed was solid. I didn't confront him. I didn't demand the truth. I did what I think many of us do when we're afraid of an answer we're not ready to hear. I told myself his explanation was reasonable, and I went to bed, and I lay awake until 3 a.m, listening to him breathe beside me, wondering who on the other end of that call had the power to bring a 20-year marriage's worth of composure to its knees in 40 minutes. The following Thursday, at almost exactly the same hour, his phone rang again. This time he took the call in his study, and he closed the door, a door that had never once been closed between us in 20 years of marriage. When he emerged, nearly an hour later, he told me he needed to run an errand, and he left the house at 8:30 in the evening, an hour when errands do not typically need running, and he did not return for almost 3 hours. That was the beginning. I want you to understand that it did not happen all at once, this decision to start watching him. It crept up on me the way suspicion always does, one small unexplained absence at a time, until one evening, about 6 weeks after that first Thursday phone call, I found myself sitting in my own car, 2 houses down from ours, watching him back out of the driveway, and before I had even fully decided to do it, I was following him. In other words, what began as a single anxious night became, over the following months, a private ritual I never spoke about to another living soul. Every few weeks, sometimes closer together, sometimes with a gap of a month or more, his phone would ring on a Thursday evening, and within an hour he would be in his car, and increasingly, without ever quite deciding to become the kind of woman who does this, I would be in mine, a careful, humiliating distance behind him. I want to tell you about the first time I followed him all the way to his destination, because it set the tone for the 2 years that followed. He drove across town to a part of the city I barely recognized. Older buildings, narrower streets, and he parked outside a modest apartment complex with peeling paint on the balcony railings. He sat in his car for a long moment before going inside. The same way, I would later learn, a man sits in his car before facing something that costs him something to face. I parked at the far end of the block, my hands cold on the wheel, and I watched him climb the exterior stairs to the 2nd floor and knock on a door that opened before his knuckles had even finished the 3rd knock, as though someone had been waiting, watching for his headlights the same way I had been watching for the sound of his car leaving our own driveway. I did not see who opened the door that night. The angle was wrong, the light too dim, and I sat there in an agony of not knowing for the 90 minutes he remained inside, constructing and dismantling a dozen different versions of my own marriage in my head. When he finally came out, he stood on the landing for a moment, and even from that distance, even through the windshield of my car in the dark, I could see him wipe his eyes before starting down the stairs. I did not confront him. I drove home ahead of him, the way I would learn to do so many times over the following 2 years, and I was already in bed, pretending to be asleep, when he came in an hour later and slipped in quietly beside me, careful not to wake me, the way a man is careful with someone he does not want to burden with his own trouble. I want to explain something about those 2 years, because I think the length of my silence is the part of this story people find hardest to understand. Why, you might be asking, did a woman follow her husband for 2 years without simply asking him directly what was happening? I have asked myself that question more times than I can count, and the honest answer is layered. Part of it was fear, the plain, animal fear of a truth that might end my marriage. Part of it was a kind of pride, the belief that if I asked and he lied to my face, I would lose not only the truth, but also my last comfortable illusion that he had never lied to me before. And part of it, I think, was a strange, misguided loyalty to him, a belief that if this was a burden he needed to carry alone, the least I could do was carry the burden of not asking, even as it slowly hollowed me out from the inside. What this actually meant, in practice, was 2 years of my life spent in a state of low, constant vigilance. I learned the sound of his phone's specific ringtone so intimately that I could hear it in my sleep. I began keeping a small, unlabeled notebook in my nightstand drawer, where I recorded, in a shorthand only I could read, the dates of his disappearances, the approximate hours, small details about the building he visited, the color of the car sometimes parked beside his outside that apartment. I told myself I was simply trying to understand a pattern. In truth, I was building a case file against my own husband, one careful entry at a time, The way you might build a case against a stranger, except this stranger held my hand every night before we fell asleep. I want to tell you about the small, cumulative toll those early months took, because I think it's easy, hearing a story like this one after it has already resolved into something gentle, to forget how corrosive the not knowing actually felt while I was living inside it. I started arriving early to appointments I didn't need to arrive early for, simply to have somewhere to sit alone with my thoughts before I had to perform normalcy again at home. I stopped answering questions from friends about how he was doing with anything more than a practiced pleasant shrug, because I no longer trusted my own voice not to crack if I said too much. I remember standing in the cereal aisle of the grocery store one Tuesday, entirely unprompted, suddenly unable to stop the tears that had been building for weeks, and having to abandon my cart and sit in my car in the parking lot until I could compose myself enough to drive home. Grief, I was learning, does not wait politely for a confirmed cause. It arrives the moment you begin suspecting one, and it settles in long before you have any proof at all. There is a particular incident, about 8 months into this pattern, that I still think about often. I followed him on a Thursday to the usual apartment building, but this time, instead of parking and waiting outside as I usually did, I found myself walking closer, close enough to see, through a gap in the curtains on the second floor, 2 shapes moving inside, my husband and a young woman with dark hair, standing close together at what looked like a kitchen counter. I could not see her face clearly. I could see only the shape of her, the way she leaned into him, the way his hand rested briefly on her shoulder before he stepped back. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment, standing on an unfamiliar street in the dark, because it was not the sharp, cinematic heartbreak you might expect. It was quieter than that, and stranger. It felt like watching my own life from very far away, as though the woman standing on that sidewalk, hollowed out and shaking, belonged to someone else's story entirely. I did not sleep that night. I lay beside him, listening to the particular rhythm of his breathing, and I made a decision that would define the next 1.5 years of my life. I decided I would not ask him directly, not yet, because some part of me, some part I am not proud of, preferred the uncertainty of not knowing to the finality of a confirmed betrayal. As long as I hadn't asked, I told myself, I still had a version of my marriage I could return to in the daylight hours, one where nothing was wrong, where my husband was simply tired from work, where the Thursday phone calls were nothing at all. I want to pause here and speak directly to anyone listening who has ever built a similar arrangement with their own fear. I understand now, looking back, that the not asking was never really protecting me. It was only delaying a pain I had already begun to feel every single day, in smaller, quieter doses, spread out over 2 years instead of concentrated into one unbearable evening. If I could go back, I would tell that version of myself that delayed pain is not smaller pain. It simply wears a disguise of patience. The months went on. I became, without ever intending to, a kind of quiet detective in my own life. I noticed a debit card statement, glimpsed accidentally while helping him find a receipt for his taxes, showing a recurring monthly transfer to an account I didn't recognize, labeled only with a set of initials, SM. I noticed, tucked in the back of his sock drawer one afternoon while putting away laundry, a small stack of birthday cards, unsent, addressed to no one, each one signed only with love always, spanning what appeared to be several years, long before that first Thursday phone call had ever rung. I noticed that on a particular date each September, a date with no significance in our own family calendar, he grew quiet and distant for several days, the way people do around anniversaries they've never explained to you. Each discovery was its own small earthquake, and each one, rather than pushing me to finally ask him outright, seemed instead to deepen my resolve to find the answer myself, on my own terms, as though uncovering the truth without his help would somehow soften whatever it turned out to be. There was a night, about 14 months into this pattern, when I very nearly did ask him. We were sitting on the back porch, the same porch where he had once paced for 40 minutes on that first Thursday, and the evening was quiet enough that I could hear the crickets starting up in the grass, and I opened my mouth to say the sentence I had rehearsed so many times in the shower, in the car, in the grocery store aisle while pretending to compare brands of coffee. I opened my mouth to say, "Who is SM?" And instead, watching the tired, gentle set of his shoulders in the porch light, I found myself asking instead, "Are you happy?" He looked at me for a long moment, and something in his face nearly broke open right there. I could see it. The same crack I'd seen the night of that first phone call. He said quietly, "I will be. I just need a little more time." And I let him have it, that time, because some old, tired part of me still believed that whatever this was, it would resolve itself before it broke us entirely. I did not yet understand that the little more time he was asking for had nothing to do with deciding whether to leave me, and everything to do with something far more fragile than our marriage, something he was terrified of losing before he'd even had the chance to fully hold on to it. There was another night, somewhere between the porch conversation and the rainy October evening that finally broke everything open, that I think about often. I had followed him again, one ordinary Thursday in late spring, and instead of parking at my usual distance, I found a spot almost directly across from the apartment building, closer than I had ever dared before. I watched a young woman step out onto the small second-floor balcony for a moment, phone pressed to her ear, laughing at something, the sound of it drifting down to me on the warm evening air. I remember feeling, absurdly, a flash of jealousy at the ease of that laugh, at how unguarded she seemed, when I had spent months growing more guarded with every passing week. I did not know yet that the ease in her laughter was the ease of a young woman who had finally, after a lifetime of wandering, found someone who belonged to her by blood. I only knew, sitting in my car that night, that whoever she was, she seemed to hold some claim on my husband's heart that I could not name and could not compete with, because I did not yet understand it wasn't a competition at all. I began, around this time, to notice changes in myself that frightened me more than anything I was observing in him. I grew shorter with our children over small things. I stopped enjoying the garden the way I once had, letting weeks go by without pulling a single weed. I lay awake calculating, with a kind of grim arithmetic, how many Thursdays remained until some unnamed deadline I had invented for myself, some point at which I told myself I would finally have to act, though I could never quite decide what action I was preparing for. In other words, the 2 years of silent watching were not simply changing what I believed about my marriage. They were slowly, quietly changing who I was inside it, hollowing out the confident, steady version of myself I had once been, and replacing her with a woman who flinched at the sound of a ringing phone. The second year of this quiet pursuit was different from the first, though I couldn't have told you exactly why at the time. The disappearances grew slightly more frequent, but something in his demeanor after each one began, slowly, to shift. He came home from the apartment building, looking less like a man returning from a confession, and more like a man returning from something that, despite its difficulty, was beginning to heal him. I noticed him humming, once, in the kitchen, the week after a Thursday call, something I hadn't heard from him in months. I noticed him smiling at his phone one afternoon, a small, private, unguarded smile, before catching himself and putting it away. I followed him, one final time, near the end of that second year, on a rainy Thursday evening in October. I want to tell you about this particular night in detail, because it was the night everything I had spent 2 years fearing finally collapsed into something entirely different. I parked in my usual spot down the block, rain streaking the windshield, and I watched him climb those familiar exterior stairs, slower than usual, favoring, I noticed for the first time, a slight stiffness in his left knee that had been getting worse for months, and that I had simply attributed to his age rather than to 2 years of stress carried silently in his body. He knocked, and the door opened, and this time, for the first time in 2 years, I saw her face clearly in the porch light. She looked to be in her early 20s, dark hair like the shape I had glimpsed before, and when she smiled at him in the doorway, something in the structure of her face, the particular tilt of her eyebrows, the shape of her jaw, hit me with a recognition so immediate and so disorienting that I had to grip the steering wheel to steady myself. She had his eyes. Exactly his eyes. I sat in my car in the rain for a long time after the door closed behind them, turning that recognition over and over, and a new fear began to displace the old one, a fear that felt, somehow, even larger than the fear of an affair. I drove home that night in a kind of daze, and for the first time in 2 years, I did not go straight to bed and pretend to be asleep when he returned. I sat at the kitchen table and waited for him. When he came in, wet from the rain, and saw me sitting there in the dark kitchen at 11 at night, he stopped in the doorway, and I watched something in him finally, after 2 years, give way entirely. He sat down across from me, and before I could say a single word, he said, "Her name is Sophie. She's 23, and she's my daughter." I want to tell you what happened next, because I think the truth, once it finally arrived, unfolded itself slowly, the way truths that have been buried for decades tend to do, layer by layer, each one changing the shape of the layer before it. He told me that when he was 19, years before we ever met, he had been in a relationship with a young woman named Susan. A relationship that ended not in betrayal but in the ordinary, painful way young relationships sometimes end, when neither person is ready for what comes next. Susan had become pregnant in the final weeks of that relationship, and in circumstances shaped by two very young, very frightened families and a different, less forgiving era, the decision had been made, largely by his own parents and hers, that the baby would be placed for adoption. He told me he had held his daughter for exactly 11 minutes in a hospital room before she was taken from him, and that for over 2 decades he had carried the guilt of that decision the way some people carry a physical injury, an old fracture that aches predictably whenever the weather changes. He told me about Susan in more detail than I expected, though gently, careful of my feelings even in the middle of his own unburdening. They had been childhood sweethearts, he said, the kind of first love that feels, at 19, as though it will simply continue forever without any particular effort, right up until the moment reality intervenes and reveals how young 19 actually is. When Susan discovered she was pregnant, both of their families had reacted with the particular, suffocating shame of a different era, an era in which a baby born to 2 unmarried teenagers was treated less like a joy to be celebrated and more like a problem to be quietly solved. He told me his own father, a stern, formal man I had met only a handful of times before his death, had sat him down and explained, without ever once raising his voice, all the ways a baby would end his son's future before it had properly begun. He said he had wanted, desperately, at 19, to fight for a different outcome, and that his failure to fight hard enough was the wound that had never fully closed, even 23 years and one entirely different life later. Susan, he told me, had moved away with her own family before the baby was born, and he had not been permitted to see her again, not even once, in those final months. He learned, second-hand, weeks after the birth, that the adoption had gone through. Arranged quietly through a private agency, the identities of the adoptive parents kept sealed. He had held his daughter only that once, in a hospital room he was allowed into for 11 minutes because a kind, rule-bending nurse took pity on a frightened boy who kept asking, over and over, if he could just see her, just once, before she was gone. He had never told me in 20 years of marriage, because by the time we met he had convinced himself that the chapter was closed, sealed away in a part of his life that predated everything we had built together, and he did not know how to introduce a grief that old into a marriage that felt to him like a fresh start he didn't want to burden with old wreckage. He said, and I remember this sentence exactly, because it undid something in me that I had held tight for 2 years. I told myself that not telling you was protecting you from a sadness that wasn't yours to carry. I didn't understand, until it was almost too late, that I was only protecting myself from having to say it out loud. He told me too about the family who had raised her, because I asked, in that quiet kitchen, whether she had been loved, and I watched his eyes soften in a way I hadn't seen in the entire 2 years of Thursday phone calls. He said her adoptive parents, a school teacher and a carpenter from 2 towns over, had given her, by every account she'd shared with him, a genuinely happy childhood, full of ordinary joys, a dog named Biscuit, summers at a lake cabin, a mother who taught her to bake bread, and a father who taught her to change a tire before she turned 16. He said this had both comforted him and quietly broken his heart in equal measure, knowing she had been raised well by people who loved her fiercely, and knowing, too, that none of those small, ordinary joys had been his to witness. The Thursday phone call, 2 years earlier, had been Sophie herself, 21 years old at the time, having spent months working up the courage to track down her biological father through records that had only recently become accessible to her. Her adoptive parents, who had raised her with love, had both passed away within 18 months of each other, first her father, then her mother. And in the wreckage of that double loss, Sophie had found herself, for the first time in her life, desperate to know where she came from, terrified of being entirely alone in the world. My husband told me that when he heard her voice on the phone that first Thursday, something in him that had been quiet for over 2 decades woke up all at once, and he was so afraid of frightening her away, afraid of what it would mean for our marriage, afraid above all of failing her a second time, that he made the decision, in that first phone call, to keep their reunion entirely secret while they slowly, carefully rebuilt something between them. He told me he had planned, every single week for 2 years, to tell me. He said he had rehearsed the conversation more times than he could count, standing in front of the bathroom mirror some mornings before work. And every time, he lost his nerve, terrified that once he said her name out loud to me, the fragile new relationship he was building with her would become real enough to lose, the way he had already lost her once before, in a hospital room, 23 years earlier. The monthly transfers labelled SM were not payments to a mistress, but a quiet fund he had been building for Sophie since the week of that first phone call, meant to help her finish the nursing degree her parents' medical bills had put out of reach. The birthday cards in his sock drawer, unsent, spanning years before that first Thursday call, were cards he had written every single year on her birthday since she was placed for adoption. Letters to a daughter he didn't yet know how to find, each one a small, private act of a father who refused to let a closed door mean he had stopped loving the person on the other side of it. The September quietness, each year, was the anniversary of the day she was taken from the hospital room, a private grief he had marked alone, every year, for over 2 decades, long before I ever became part of his life. I asked him about the small stiffness I'd noticed in his knee on those stairs, half expecting some unrelated answer, and he told me with a small, embarrassed laugh that felt like the first genuinely light moment of that entire long night, that he had fallen 3 times over the 2 years, hurrying up those same steps, twice in the rain and once on ice, always afraid of being even a few minutes late, as though every visit might be the one where she changed her mind about wanting him in her life at all. I understood, hearing that, the particular quality of fear that had shaped his last 2 years, not the fear of being caught, which was the fear I had spent 2 years assuming was driving him, but the fear of a second chance slipping away before it had fully taken root. I asked him, that night at the kitchen table, why once Sophie came back into his life, he hadn't simply told me the whole truth from the beginning, rather than let 2 years pass in silence. He said something I have thought about almost every day since. He said, "I was so afraid that if I told you too soon, before I knew whether she would even want a relationship with me, I would have to explain not just her existence, but my own shame at having let her go in the first place. I didn't know how to say all of that to you without also saying I had failed as a father before I ever became one to our own children. I was ashamed, Diane. I have been ashamed for 23 years, and shame doesn't know how to speak. It only knows how to hide." I sat with him at that kitchen table for a long time after he finished speaking, the rain still ticking softly against the window, and I found myself, quite unexpectedly, reaching across to take his hand, the same hand that had knocked on that apartment door so many nervous Thursdays in a row. I remember thinking, in that strange, quiet moment, how odd it was that the very stillness of that hand in mine felt more honest than anything he had said to me in 2 years, as though the truth had finally given him permission to simply be present with me again, without the low hum of a secret running underneath everything. I want to tell you what happened after that night, because I think the ending of this story matters as much as the 2 years of silent watching that came before it. I did not leave him. I did not, as I might once have imagined I would in the moment I finally learned the truth, feel the vindication of having been right to suspect something was wrong. I felt, instead, a grief that surprised me with its size. Grief for the frightened 19-year-old boy he had been, forced by circumstances larger than himself to let go of a daughter he had held for only 11 minutes, and grief for the 2 years I had spent building a case file against a man who had, in fact, only ever been trying, clumsily and imperfectly, to protect a second chance he did not yet trust himself to keep. The following Thursday, I asked to come with him. He looked at me across the kitchen for a long moment. The same look he'd given me the night of that first phone call, except this time it wasn't fear I saw in his face. It was something closer to hope. He said, "I'd like that, if you're ready." I told our own 2 children the following week, sitting them down at the same kitchen table where their father had finally told me the truth. Our daughter, 25 and always the more guarded of the 2, went quiet for a long time, turning her water glass slowly in her hands, before asking the question I had asked myself so many times over the previous 2 years. Why hadn't he told any of us sooner? Our son, younger and softer-hearted, cried almost immediately, not out of anger, he explained through his tears, but out of a strange, sudden grief for a sister he'd never known he had, 23 years' worth of birthdays and holidays she had spent apart from a family that would have loved her without hesitation, had anyone known to include her. I watched my husband absorb both of their reactions with the same quiet steadiness he had carried through the entire 2 years of secrecy, apologizing to each of them in turn, not defending himself, simply absorbing their questions the way a man absorbs a truth he has finally, after decades, stopped trying to outrun. Our daughter came around first, in the end, in her own careful way. She asked to see a photograph, and when my husband showed her the one from the shoebox, the young frightened boy and his 11 minutes, she was quiet again, and then she said, softly, "I want to meet her." Our son needed longer, not out of resentment, but out of a tender protective instinct toward his father that surprised me, a fierce insistence on understanding every detail of why the secret had lasted as long as it had before he would agree to move forward. I found myself, in those weeks, playing a role I hadn't expected, not the wounded wife rebuilding her own trust, but a kind of bridge between my husband and our children, translating his shame into language they could finally hear as love rather than betrayal. I met Sophie for the first time on a rainy evening much like the one when I'd finally seen her face clearly through his windshield. She opened the door with the same cautious warmth I imagined she'd offered her father 2 years earlier, and when he introduced me, she looked at me for a long moment and said, "I've wanted to meet you for months. He talks about you all the time." I hadn't expected that. I had spent 2 years imagining myself as a stranger to whatever was happening behind that apartment door, and instead I learned that I had been present in it, spoken of with love, for far longer than I'd known. She showed me, that first evening, a small shoebox of things her adoptive parents had kept for her over the years. A hospital bracelet, a single photograph of a very young man holding a newborn in a hospital room, eyes wet, exactly 11 minutes worth of love captured in a single frame before it was taken away. I sat on her second-hand sofa, in an apartment I had once watched from a distance with a stranger's suspicion, and I understood, finally, the full shape of what those 2 years of Thursday phone calls had actually been protecting. Our daughter and son met her the following month, at a dinner my husband organized with a nervousness I hadn't seen in him since our own wedding day. I watched the 4 of them, my husband, our daughter, our son, and the sister none of them had grown up knowing, sit around our dining table long after the food had gone cold, trading stories, laughing at the strange, uncanny overlaps between Sophie's mannerisms and our son's, the identical way they both tilted their heads when they were thinking hard about something. I sat back for a while that evening, simply watching, and I thought about the 2 years I had spent parked down the block from this exact kind of joy, mistaking it from a distance for something to fear. Sophie told me, months later, over coffee, just the 2 of us, that she had been terrified in those early Thursday visits that my husband's wife would eventually find out and demand he choose between his old family and his new one. She said she had braced herself every single week for nearly 2 years for a phone call or a knock on the door that would end everything. Some furious wife arriving to reclaim a husband Sophie had only just started to feel she had any right to share. I told her, as gently as I could, about the notebook in my nightstand drawer, about the 2 years I had spent constructing an entirely different, entirely wrong story out of the same silence that had frightened her just as deeply from the other side of it. We sat with that shared irony for a long moment, 2 women who had each spent 2 years afraid of losing the same man to a story that had never actually been true. I think about those 2 years often now. The notebook still sitting, unused, in the back of my nightstand drawer, a record of a marriage I nearly convinced myself was ending, built entirely out of my own silence, and his. I want to say clearly, for anyone listening who recognizes their own version of that notebook, their own quiet Thursdays spent parked down the block from their own life, not every silence is a wound waiting to happen. Sometimes silence is simply shame that hasn't yet learned how to become a story. That does not mean my 2 years of following him were foolish, or that my fear was unreasonable. I want to be honest about that. A closed study door, a flat voice, a monthly transfer to unfamiliar initials. These are not small things, and a woman who notices them is not a woman failing at trust. She is a woman paying attention. If I could go back, I would not tell myself to abandon my instincts. I would tell myself, instead, to trust them enough to speak them out loud far sooner than 2 years in, rather than trusting them only enough to follow a car through the dark alone, night after night, carrying the whole weight of my fear by myself when I could have set half of it down on the kitchen table at any point and asked for the truth. I would tell myself this, and I offer it now to anyone listening who is sitting, tonight, in their own version of a parked car outside a building they don't understand. Know your worth, and trust that you deserve the truth sooner than shame is often willing to offer it. Silence, even loving silence, is still a kind of theft, taking from you the years you might have spent healing together instead of grieving alone. Understand that a person's shame about their own past is not evidence of a present betrayal. The two can look identical from a parked car in the dark, and it takes courage, real courage, to ask a direct question instead of building an entire private mythology out of half-seen shapes through a curtain. Remember that some doors close not because love has ended, but because love once cost someone more than they knew how to survive without protecting themselves from ever paying that price again. Compassion for that fear does not mean excusing the silence. It means understanding it well enough to finally help someone set it down. Learn, too, that the length of a silence is not proof of its danger. I spent 2 years assuming that the longer his secret lasted, the darker it must be, as though time itself were evidence of betrayal. I understand now that time is not always evidence of anything except how frightened a person is. And fear, however long it lingers, is not the same thing as guilt. Some of the gentlest truths I have ever encountered were also the ones that took the longest to be spoken, simply because the person carrying them needed that much time to believe they deserved to be forgiven for the silence itself. And believe, finally, that the truth you've spent months or years quietly chasing is rarely the monster your sleepless nights have built. Far more often, hiding behind that locked door, you will find not an ending but a beginning someone was simply too frightened to introduce you to. I would add one more thing, gently, for the version of you who might still be sitting in your own parked car tonight, engine off, watching a door you don't yet understand. Give yourself permission to ask sooner than I did. 2 years is a long time to carry a fear alone, when the person who could set it down for you is sleeping in the very next room. You do not have to wait for a rainy October night, or a chance glimpse of a familiar jawline through a porch light, to finally deserve the truth. You are allowed to ask for it, the very first time your hands go cold at the sound of a phone ringing on a Thursday evening. I think, too, about the notebook itself, which I finally took out of the nightstand drawer about a month after that rainy October night. I sat with it at the kitchen table one afternoon, reading back through 2 years of dates and initials and half-glimpsed shapes through curtains, a private history of a marriage I had nearly convinced myself was ending. I did not throw it away in the end. I keep it still, in a different drawer now, not as evidence of anything, but as a reminder of how easily fear can write an entire story out of nothing but shadows, and how much gentler the truth so often turns out to be than the version we build alone, in the dark, in a parked car, waiting. Sophie comes to our home most Sundays now, alongside our own children, who have folded her into the family with an ease I never expected and am endlessly grateful for. She calls my husband Dad now, tentatively at first, and then, over the following months, with a comfort that still catches in my throat every time I hear it. I keep a photograph on our mantel now, the one from the shoebox, a very young man holding his newborn daughter for 11 irreplaceable minutes, and I think, every time I pass it, about the 2 years I spent afraid of a shadow that turned out, in the end, to be nothing more than a father trying, quietly and imperfectly, to become one all over again. Last month, on a warm Thursday evening, I stood at the kitchen window and watched my husband's car pull into the driveway, right on time, no longer trailing 2 years of secrecy behind it. Sophie was in the passenger seat, laughing at something he'd said, and our own daughter's car pulled in right behind them a moment later. I did not feel, this time, the old cold drop in my stomach I had carried through so many identical Thursday evenings. I felt only the particular, unremarkable warmth of watching a family arrive home, whole in a way I once feared we would never be again, and I understood, finally and completely, that the silence I had spent 2 years following through the dark had never once been protecting a betrayal. It had only ever been protecting a love, too frightened, for too long, to say its own name out loud. If this story brought some value to your life, please consider clicking like. It is the only way we know this content was truly meaningful to you.